In one word, what would you say your life is now? If we're honest, here's what some people would say. Some people would say, well, my life is money. If I'm going to be just really honest, deep down, my life is money. It revolves around money. I'm consumed with making money. Other people would say, my life is sex. And there are people out there, they live for the one-night stand, and they live for this relationship and that relationship. There are a lot of people who would say today, my life is drugs. I'm an addict, and whatever else I've got to have drugs. Some people would say, my life is fame. I live for the applause of the world. Some people would say, well, my life is sports. I want football, basketball, baseball, golf. My life is sports. There are some people who are very noble. They would say, well, my life is family. It's my wife. It's my kids. It's my grandkids. Paul said, my life is Christ. The obsession of my life is Christ. The love of my life is Christ. The foundation of my life is Christ. The center of my life is Christ. The circumference of my life is Christ. The obsession of my life is Christ. My life is Christ. So let me just stop. That makes perfect sense if you're a follower of Christ. So let me tell you why. If the gospel is true, that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, died on a cross, came back from the dead, paid for all of our sins, and He's King of Kings and Lord of Lords, if all of that's true, then there are no alternatives to Christ. What other choice is there out there? What other option is there out there? As a matter of fact, I want to make a proposition to you. I want you to think about two things right now. Think about your life and think about Christ. All right? Think about your life and think about Christ. Now, I want you to put those two things together, and I want to propose to you two propositions. Jesus alone is worthy of your life. Nothing else, not money, not fame, not fortune, not popularity, not power, not influence, nothing else is worthy of your life except Jesus. Secondly, your life is too valuable to give to anything but Jesus. It's just too valuable. It's worth too much. Christianity is Christ, period. End of discussion. It's not church. It's not preaching. It's not religion. It's not the way you dress. It's not doing this or doing that. It's not keeping that command, not breaking that command. Christianity is Christ. It is Jesus. Let me put it to you this way. You can take Buddha out of Buddhism, you'll still have Buddhism. You can take Muhammad out of Islam, you'll still have Islam. You can take Confucius out of Confucianism, and you'll still have Confucianism. You'll be confused, but you'll still have Confucianism. But if you take Jesus out of Christianity, you have nothing. Christianity is Christ. Now, I want to tell you the single most important thing that should be true of your life if you have the right view of life. Because some of you are probably sitting there wondering right now, hey, I'm not really sure, do I really have the right view of life? Well, I'll tell you the single most important thing that's true about you if you do. The single most important thing about you, if you have the right view of life, is whether or not the people that you are closest to and the people that are closest to you and the people that come in contact with you, your spouse, your children, your family, your colleagues, your workmates, your teammates, your neighbors, here's the key. Do they see Jesus in the way you live? Now, if they do, you've got the right view of life. When Henry IV was the king of France, some of his servants and courtiers were complimenting him on how vigorous he was, even though he was growing older. And one of them said, "Sire, you might even live to be 80 years of age." And when they said when that servant said this to him, listen to what King Henry IV said. This is so good. He said, "The number of our days is reckoned. I've often prayed to God for grace, but never for a long life. A man who has lived well has always lived long enough, however early he may die." A man who has lived well has always lived long enough, however early he may die. If you want to die right, you got to live right. And if you want to live right, you got to have the right view of life. And there's only one view of life that is right, and that is if you can honestly say, "For to me to live is Christ." That's the right view of life. Then we got to have something else. We've got to have the right version of death. Got to have the right view of life, but we got to have the right version of death. Now listen to the second part of this verse again. Ready? He says, now for to me to live is Christ. And then he says something that I know a lot of you are going to say, not buying that. And to die is gain. Now the word there for gain literally means profitable. It means beneficial. It means it is a good thing. Now let's just be honest. The only people that we think or believe that death is gain for are people who run funeral homes. Okay? We're going, I don't know that death is a gain for me, because I really believe, I think the last thing hardly any of us think about when it comes to death is, oh man, that's a good thing. Really, unless you're really on the outs with somebody, or you're mad at somebody, or you don't like somebody, when somebody says, hey, did you hear so-and-so died? The first thing you say is not, that's cool. Really? Boy, that's great. Man, that's fantastic. Got any more good news? We were just told, oh man, that's so sad, and that's so bad, and that's so heartbreaking. And yet Paul said, if your life is Christ, then your death is gain. If your life is Christ, then your death is gain. Now let me just stop. I know that's a hard sell. And I'm not talking to those of you who may not know Christ, or you're not a believer, you're not a follower of Jesus. That's a hard sell to a lot of us right now who are followers of Jesus. You do love Jesus. I'm going to prove it to you. If you're a follower of Jesus, and don't raise your hand, but if I were to ask you this question, do you really believe that when you die, you're going to heaven? You'd nod your head. If I were to say to you, well, do you believe that heaven is the most wonderful place in the universe? You'd nod your head. But then you know what we all do? We spend a lot of time doing everything we can to keep from going there. Right? And Joe Louis, the famous boxer, he said everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. It's true. Well, we're going to go to heaven. We don't want to die. And yet Paul said, that's not me. I tell you, when I think about death, here's the word I think about. To die is gain. Now, you may think, I don't believe that. He's just blowing smoke. Well, I'll tell you why I believe what he says, because what he said in verse 23, listen to this. He said, I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is better by far. Now, I want you to let those words sink in a minute. I'm really torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. Now, we're going to get honest, all of us, including me. His attitude is 180 degrees different from our attitude. Okay? Here's what we would all say if we were honest. We're willing to go to heaven, but we want to stay here as long as we're healthy. And we want to, we want to enjoy our family, and we want to enjoy our friends, and we want to enjoy life. We're willing to go, but we want to stay. Listen, I'm honest. The older you get, the less you care what people think, okay? I don't want to die till Georgia wins one more national championship. Just one. I just want one. I don't want 2 or 3. Just give me one more. Paul said, it's not me. James, you're willing to go, but you want to stay. I'm willing to stay, but I want to go. Paul said, when you've got the right view of life is Christ, you'll have the right version of death. To die is gain. Now watch what happens. When I have the right view of life, and when I have the right version of death, then I must have the right vision of life and death. Now I want you to watch how Paul closes this up. Paul says, it's only when you have the right view of life and the right version of death, you'll have the right vision of life and death. Now, you know what that vision is? And by the way, you will know that you've captured that vision. You know how you'll know it? You'll know that you've got the right view of life. You'll know you've got the right version of death. You'll know you've got the right vision of life and death when you are really conflicted. There are going to be times there's going to be a battle going on in your soul as to what to do. Because I want to go back to that statement one more time, what Paul thinks about living and dying. Now listen to what he says. I'm torn. Most of us are not torn. I know what I want to do. You know what you want to do? I want to be here for a while. Paul says, not me. I'm torn. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. So he said, look, I got a battle going on. The battle's going on between my desire and my duty. That's the battle. My desire is to leave and be with Jesus. I want to go today. I want to go now. I'm ready. But I've got a duty to stay and work for Jesus. So my problem is, I'm willing to stay here, but I want to go there. Where we say, well, I'm willing to go there, but I want to stay here. But here's what I want you to understand. Why was Paul willing to stay? Why was Paul willing to stay? Totally different. It was not, now some of you are not going to like this. In fact, I'm about to meddle right now, so just get ready. It was not so he could retire, do what he wanted to do, go where he wanted to go, put his feet up on the couch, watch TV, go to the mall, travel the world, and see all the sights. Now, let me just stop. Nothing wrong with any of those things. I'm not critical of any of those things. That's not the point. Paul said, you know why I'm willing to stay? If this is what God will, you know why I'm willing to hang around for a while? Now, watch what he says. If I'm to go on living in the body, this will mean not retirement, not becoming a couch potato, not heading off to the beach in Florida. It will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. Now here's why I want to meddle a minute. If your goal is to live a long time so you can retire, you got the wrong view of life. You've got the wrong version of death. And you've got the wrong vision of life and death. Paul said, you know why I'm willing to live a long time? Not so I can retire, but so I can re-enlist. So I can leave my earthly job for what God wants me to do. Now, if you've not heard anything else I've said, whether you are young or whether you are old, I want you to listen to this next statement. Okay, this is the one, just please hear this before you hear anything else. You should never finish living until your work for God is finished, and God is never finished with you until your work for Him is finished. You should never finish living until your work for God is finished, and God is never finished with you until your work for Him is finished, and God's not finished with your work for Him until He's finished with you. So you say, Pastor, how do I know when my work on earth is done? When you're out of here. Until then, you got something you can do for God and something you can do for others. You may retire from your work. You never retire from God's work. Never. There was a philosopher by the name of Horace Callan. He put it perfectly when he said this. Listen to this. He said, there are those who guide their lives by the fear of death, and there are those who guide their lives by the joy of life. The former live dying, the latter die living. When I die, I intend to die living. That's how I want to die. I want to die living. Well, what did Paul mean by that? I want to die living. All right, listen, and we're going to wrap this up. He said, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but I'll have sufficient courage so that now as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Now listen to what Paul said. Paul said, look, the important thing about your life is not how much money you make, or how many years you accumulate, or how many skills that you master. He said, what's important about your life, who do you magnify? That word exalt means to magnify. Who do you magnify? He said, you know what? The way I live, I want it to magnify Jesus. And the way I die, I want it to magnify Jesus. Now that raises a question. Wait a minute. Does Jesus, the Son of God, the King of Kings, the Lord of the Lords, the Creator of the universe, does He really need to be magnified? Well, yes, He does. Let me tell you why. Go out tonight, if it's clear, and look up in the sky and just look at all the stars. Now here's something we all know. Every star that you see is a lot bigger than it looks to the naked eye, because if it wasn't, you couldn't even see it. So we know it's a lot bigger. But here's what will happen. You can go to a Hubble telescope and look at those same stars, and all of a sudden you realize, dear Lord, I didn't know how big that star was. I didn't know how bright that star was. And what Paul was saying was, our body, whether it's in life or in death, Our body is to be a telescope that brings people closer to Jesus and makes Jesus even bigger. As a matter of fact, there's not a better way for us to live our life every day than to be asking this question every day. Am I magnifying Jesus in my life? Is the way I live, is the way I conduct myself, is the way I do business, is the way I treat my neighbors, is the way I treat my family, my wife, my kids, is the way that I handle my transactions, is it magnifying Jesus? And you may say, wait a minute, how do you do that? How do you magnify Jesus? All kinds of ways. With our lips, we can magnify Jesus by the words that we say. With our hands, we can magnify Jesus by the deeds that we do. With our feet, we can magnify Jesus by the places that we go. With our hearts, we can magnify Jesus by the love that we share. But Paul said, look, whether we live or whether we die, we ought to magnify Jesus. Let me tell you what he meant. We ought to live in such a way that people would see Jesus in us. And we ought to die in such a way that people will remember Jesus about us. I've often thought about dying, and you think more about it. I'm not morbid about it, but you think about it as you get older. And so I get to kind of fantasizing, I guess you'd say. So I've died and I'm in heaven, and there will be times somebody will say to one of my sons, or they'll say to one of my grandchildren, Merritt, did you happen to know a James Merrett? Yeah, that was my dad, or that was my pop. And I hope that what they'll say is, boy, your dad was all about Jesus. That's all he talked about. He preached Jesus. Every message was full of Jesus. He loved Jesus. He shared Jesus. He lived for Jesus. That's what I want people to do. I want people, when as they watch me live today, see Jesus. And when I die, I want them to think about Jesus. You know, in Africa, a lot of Christians pray what they'll call, they pray that they'll die what they call a good death. And what they mean by dying a good death is not a death that's free of pain or free of suffering. What they mean by good death is this. They say a good death is when you die, regardless of how you die, when you die, God is glorified, Jesus is magnified, and faith is multiplied. They said that's dying a good death. Here's what Paul said. We're going to wrap all this up. Paul said, if I live, I'm going to live for Jesus. If I die, I'm going to live with Jesus. So to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. Dr. Rogers, when he preached on this text, you know what the title of his sermon was? I love it. I wish I'd stolen it from him. Heads I win, tails I win. Isn't that good? If you're a Christian, that's true. Heads I win, tails I win. Now, we're going to get this real personal applicable, then we're going to pray. So you were on a street yesterday. You were downtown in Atlanta, and you kind of turn a corner, and there's somebody there with a with a notebook and a pen or a legal pad, and they say, excuse me, I'm taking a survey. Could I just ask you a question? How would you fill in this blank? For to me to live is blank. You didn't have any prior warning. You didn't know what they're doing. For to me to live is blank. Now, there's no need to lie. How would you have answered that question yesterday? If some of you are honest, some of us are honest. Well, for me to live is money. For to me to live is fame. Well, to me to live is my job. For me to live is family. And what Paul would say is, if you put anything in that blank except Jesus, then for you to die is loss.